A century-old treaty is quietly unraveling in the Arctic, and the consequences could reshape global naval power. Svalbard, an archipelago twice the size of Belgium, sits at the center of a legal dispute that's becoming impossible to ignore. In 1920, 48 nations signed the Svalbard Treaty, handing sovereignty to Norway with strings attached. Those strings are now being pulled in directions nobody anticipated. Russia insists Norway is violating the agreement. China references it to justify Arctic ambitions. And the document itself contains ambiguities that lawyers in Oslo have been wrestling with for decades. The treaty grants Norway full sovereignty over Svalbard, but not the kind of sovereignty most countries enjoy. Article 9 restricts military installations. Equal access provisions give all signatory nations rights to commercial activities, primarily coal mining. For 100 years, this arrangement worked reasonably well. Then modern maritime law evolved and everything got complicated. Here's where the legal foundation starts cracking. The 1920 treaty mentions territorial waters but says nothing about continental shelves or exclusive economic zones. Those concepts didn't exist yet. Norway now claims a 200 nautical mile fisheries protection zone around Svalbard, arguing the treaty only applies within 12 nautical miles. Multiple signatory nations disagree. They claim equal access extends to these newer maritime zones. This isn't abstract legal theory. We're talking about massive reserves of oil, natural gas, and rare earth minerals. The Barents Sea continental shelf contains resources worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Who controls access to those resources depends entirely on how you interpret a document written before anyone imagined offshore drilling. The snow crab dispute illustrates how quickly this turns contentious. In 2015, Russia sent a diplomatic note to Oslo claiming that Norwegian oil and gas licenses in the Barents Sea violated the Svalbard Treaty because the blocks sat on Svalbard's continental shelf. The resources belong to all treaty signatories, not just Norway. Meanwhile, a separate fight erupted over snow crab fishing on the seabed. Norway classified snow crabs as sedentary species, meaning they fall under continental shelf regulations rather than fishing rights. Other nations saw this as Norway exploiting technicalities to exclude them from valuable fisheries. A Latvian company challenged Norway's snow crab regulations all the way to the Norwegian Supreme Court in 2023. The court sided with Norway, ruling that treaty provisions don't extend beyond 12 nautical miles of territorial waters. The losing side attempted international arbitration. That failed too. But settling the issue in Norwegian courts doesn't mean the dispute is settled. It means the disagreement has entered a new phase where diplomatic pressure replaces legal arguments. What seems like a fight over crustaceans actually sets precedent for everything else. If Norway successfully limits treaty provisions to 12 nautical miles for snow crabs, the same logic applies to oil exploration, water gas drilling, and mineral extraction across vast stretches of seabed. The outcome determines who profits from Arctic resources as ice continues melting. Russia's approach to Svalbard has shifted noticeably. For decades, Moscow seemed content with the status quo, maintaining coal mining operations through the state company Arktikugol while respecting Norwegian administration. That changed in March 2025 when Russian officials told the Norwegian ambassador that Norway was undermining the international legal basis of the archipelago's status. This wasn't diplomatic courtesy, it was a direct challenge. By November 2025, Russia's Deputy Prime Minister Yuri Trutnev chaired a governmental commission focused specifically on Svalbard. He emphasized that Russia must not lose any rights under the treaty. The federal budget allocated over 900 million rubles to support Arktikugol. Trutnev praised the company for opposing Norwegian authorities, a remarkable statement that signals Moscow's willingness to escalate tensions. Then the symbolic gestures started. In Pyramiden, a Russian mining settlement, workers replaced the Norwegian flag with the Soviet flag. A Russian Orthodox bishop visited and erected a massive cross on the mountainside, decorated in black and orange. Those specific colors mark Russian military vehicles in Ukraine. The symbolism wasn't subtle. The Kremlin uses the Orthodox Church to advance territorial narratives, and this was spiritual justification for Russian claims in the Arctic. June 2025 brought an almost theatrical confrontation. Norway's 88-year-old King Harald and Queen Sonja visited Svalbard at the same time as Bishop Vladika Yakov, known for promoting Russian territorial claims. Different locations, same island, competing displays of presence and authority. These weren't coincidental scheduling conflicts. The Svalbard Act, Norway's domestic legislation governing the archipelago, creates additional complexity. The act incorporates treaty obligations, but also extends Norwegian law in ways that signatory nations challenge. Environmental regulations, tax structures, and administrative procedures all become points of contention when other countries claim Norway is exceeding its authority. What makes this particularly volatile is that Svalbard isn't just about resources or legal interpretation. Geography matters. The archipelago controls access to the Bear Gap, where the Barents Sea meets the Norwegian Sea. Russia's Northern Fleet missile submarines based on the Kola Peninsula must cross this zone to reach deep Atlantic waters. Controlling Svalbard means controlling that passage. The islands also sit near the GIUK Gap, the maritime corridor between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. These waterways connected North America to Europe during both World Wars. They remain critical for transatlantic naval movement. Whoever controls Svalbard could potentially deny NATO access to both choke points during conflict. Military analysts have sketched out scenarios that resemble Crimea in 2014. Russian forces could launch from Nagarskoye base and reach Svalbard in hours. Norway stations no armed forces on the archipelago because of treaty restrictions. The closest Norwegian base sits more than twice as far away. Unmarked special forces could establish control before NATO formulates a response. Then comes the impossible choice: counterattack with significant casualties or negotiate while alliance credibility crumbles. During the Zapad 2025 military exercises, one scenario specifically involved attacking and occupying Svalbard. Russian landing ships practiced deploying troops and armored vehicles while eliminating imagined enemy saboteurs on the archipelago. This wasn't just another military drill. The exercise treated Svalbard occupation as a legitimate strategic objective. China adds another layer of complexity. Beijing established the Yellow River Station in Ny-Ålesund back in 2004. The facility presents itself as scientific research, but Norwegian intelligence assessments suggest dual-use capabilities: surveillance, navigation systems, communications infrastructure. Research stations make excellent cover for monitoring activities. In April 2025, Norwegian authorities suddenly objected to two lion sculptures that had sat outside the Chinese facility for 20 years without incident. Shortly after, Svalbard's only higher education institution announced it could no longer accept Chinese students. Security concerns meant past students couldn't access certain field trips or company visits. China references the Svalbard Treaty to justify its Arctic presence, claiming rights as a signatory nation. While Russia dominates Norway's security focus, Norwegian policymakers privately acknowledge that China's Arctic ambitions definitely include Svalbard. The snow crab dispute reveals how seemingly minor issues test the entire treaty framework. In 2015, Russia challenged Norwegian oil and gas licenses in the Barents Sea, claiming 3 blocks sat on Svalbard's continental shelf. A diplomatic note stated those resources fell under treaty regulations. Then came the snow crab controversy. These crustaceans live on the seabed beyond territorial waters. Norway argues they're sedentary species covered by continental shelf jurisdiction, not fishing rights. A Latvian company challenged this in Norway's Supreme Court, claiming the treaty guaranteed equal access. In 2023, the court ruled treaty provisions don't extend beyond the 12 nautical mile territorial sea. The company tried international arbitration. That failed too. But here's what matters. Snow crabs seem trivial compared to oil, gas, and rare earth metals in the same waters. The legal precedent from this dispute determines access to far more valuable resources. Norway won in its own courts, but that doesn't settle international disagreements. The treaty itself creates the problem. Written in 1920, it recognized Norway's sovereignty while granting 48 signatory nations equal rights to fish and hunt within Svalbard's territory and territorial waters. Territorial waters meant something specific in 1920. Modern law of the sea changed everything. Norway now claims a 200 nautical mile fisheries protection zone around Svalbard. Several signatories insist treaty rights extend into these expanded zones. Norway points to the original wording, applicable within 12 nautical mile territorial waters. That's it. Nothing about continental shelves or exclusive economic zones because those concepts didn't exist when the treaty was drafted. This ambiguity isn't accidental oversight, it's fundamental incompatibility between 1920 maritime law and current international frameworks. Recent American focus on Greenland intensifies Norwegian anxiety about precedent. Thomas Emanuel Dans, Trump's Greenland advisor, told reporters Washington isn't interested in Svalbard the same way. Norwegian Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre insists they're completely different situations. But if the United States somehow gained control of Greenland, what message does that send? That major powers can simply acquire strategically valuable Arctic territories. International law becomes meaningless if territorial integrity depends solely on military capability. Climate change accelerates everything. Svalbard warms 6 to 7 times faster than the global average. February 2025 brought unprecedented winter temperatures and rainfall that triggered massive snowmelt across the archipelago. Winter thaw events now reshape Arctic landscapes regularly. This isn't gradual change measured in decades. It's dramatic transformation happening in years. Melting sea ice opens access to resources previously locked away. Gas drilling, oil extraction, fishing, tourism. Each activity increases human presence and raises environmental concerns. Russia particularly focuses on the northern sea route's commercial potential. The passage offers a shortcut between Europe and Asia that becomes more viable every year as ice recedes. The legal framework can't handle current realities. A treaty designed for coal mining rights in 1920 now governs disputes over continental shelf resources, military positioning, and great power competition. Norway administers Svalbard through the Svalbard Act, domestic legislation that incorporates treaty obligations while extending Norwegian law. Environmental regulations, tax structures, administrative procedures. Every Norwegian policy decision becomes a potential treaty violation in the eyes of other signatories. The act tries to balance sovereignty with international obligations, but signatory nations challenge whether Norway exceeds its authority. 48 countries signed the treaty. Most have minimal practical interest in Svalbard, but Russia, China, and increasingly the United States view the archipelago through strategic lenses that have nothing to do with fishing rights or scientific research. The islands control access to critical naval choke points. They sit at the intersection of Arctic Ocean routes and Atlantic approaches. Whoever holds Svalbard holds leverage over transatlantic security architecture. Norway can't militarize the islands without violating treaty restrictions. Yet those same restrictions leave Svalbard vulnerable to the exact scenario military analysts keep sketching. Russia maintains permanent presence through Arktikugol. China operates research facilities. Norway administers but doesn't defend in any meaningful military sense. The treaty that granted Norway sovereignty simultaneously limits how Norway can exercise that sovereignty. As ice melts and tensions rise, this contradiction becomes harder to ignore. Resources become accessible. Strategic value increases. Legal ambiguities multiply. And everyone involved knows the 1920 treaty framework wasn't built for what's coming. The question isn't whether Svalbard becomes a flashpoint, it's when. Every element converges, melting ice revealing resources, competing interpretations of century-old treaty language, military exercises practicing occupation scenarios, and great powers treating Arctic territories as strategic prizes rather than sovereign lands. Norway holds legal title but lacks military means to enforce it. Russia signals willingness to challenge the arrangement diplomatically and symbolically. China builds infrastructure under research pretenses. The United States watches nervously while contemplating Greenland. What happens when economic incentives, strategic imperatives, and legal ambiguities all point toward confrontation? The snow crab dispute demonstrated that even minor resource questions expose fundamental disagreements about treaty scope. Now imagine that same dynamic applied to offshore oil fields worth hundreds of billions. The framework collapses under pressure it was never designed to withstand. Svalbard's next 100 years won't resemble its first. The treaty worked when the Arctic remained frozen, remote, and economically marginal. That world no longer exists. As temperatures rise and ice retreats, Svalbard transforms from obscure archipelago into contested territory where international law meets geopolitical reality. The legal flashpoint isn't coming. It's already here.